I was honored as a colonel and given millions of dollars, yet not a single child of mine showed up. They had called me useless, a burden, not worth standing beside. Sitting in that hall, I felt the silence of their absence heavier than any medal on my chest. The pain cut deeper than the years I spent fighting for this country. But when they learned about the land and the money, they came crawling back, ready to claim what was never theirs. That was the moment everything changed. The applause echoed through the hall, polite and distant. I sat there in my dark navy suit, my medals catching the light from the stage. The MC had just read my name out loud for the final time that afternoon, his voice clear, proud, professional. Colonel Miriam Lockwood. I nodded, smiled a little. I thanked the man who handed me the commemorative plaque, and I turned to face a sea of strangers. In the first row, 4 seats were left empty, reserved with printed name cards: Bradley Lockwood, Fiona Kerr, family of honoree. Those names stayed untouched, flapping slightly each time someone walked past. Everyone around me clapped and smiled like this was a celebration. And it was, I suppose. But all I felt was the weight of absence, the cold, humiliating kind. Because my children hadn't just missed a moment. They had made a statement. Last week I asked Fiona if she would be there. She had sighed into the phone like I'd inconvenienced her, said something about a client dinner and how it would be awkward for her to explain the whole wheelchair situation. That was her word. Awkward. Not heartbreaking, not cruel, just inconvenient. Bradley didn't even bother to call. He had his assistant text me a thumbs-up emoji when I told him about the ceremony. Nothing else. That was all I got. So yes. I sat alone, while a standing ovation rang out around me, while the mayor shook my hand and said, Seattle was proud to honor its daughters, while a local school choir sang a patriotic medley I couldn't even process. I just kept staring at those 4 empty chairs. I served 24 years in the Navy Reserve, did 2 tours overseas, made it through surgeries, rehab, and nights soaked in morphine and shame. I didn't expect parades, but I had thought, just maybe, that my kids would show up when the country did. You know, people talk about honor like it's made of flags and folded uniforms. But today, it sat like a pit in my stomach. No one from my own family thought I was worth showing up for. Not one of them. After the program ended, I moved with the crowd toward the reception area, wheeling myself down the side corridor. Carmen, my old friend from the base, found me near the coffee table. She hugged me tight, her arms warm and real. They didn't come, did they? She whispered near my ear. I shook my head. Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing more. Just stayed by my side like she always had. People think turning 73 means you're used to disappointment, that the sting fades with time. But no, it sharpens. Because at this age, you've run out of illusions. You see people for exactly who they are. You understand that waiting for them to become someone else is a waste of breath. That's what I was thinking when I noticed the event photographer snapping pictures of the guests and honorees. I waved him over, asked him to take one good shot of me in front of the flag. Just me. I wanted a picture that told the truth. As I posed, my phone buzzed in the pocket of my coat. I ignored it. Then it buzzed again, and again. By the time I rolled back toward the elevator, there were 6 missed calls and a flurry of texts. Not from Fiona, not from Bradley, but from people I hadn't spoken to in months. A cousin I barely knew, a former neighbor from Ballard, even someone from church who never remembered my name. And that's when it hit me. The ceremony had been streamed live. The announcement had been made publicly that I was being honored as a colonel. that I was receiving a commemorative endowment and a significant development grant tied to veteran community work. It wasn't just a medal and a plaque. It was money, land, access. That was the real headline. The MC had only said it once, but clearly it had reached all the right ears. Or the wrong ones. By the time I got to the lobby, Bradley had called twice. Fiona had texted me a heart emoji. The same woman who called my wheelchair awkward had just sent me a heart. Carmen watched me read the messages. "Well, look at that," she said. "Now they remember who you are." I looked up at her. Something shifted in me then. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was colder than that. A kind of final clarity. The kind that comes when you finally stop hoping someone will love you the way they're supposed to. Thank you for staying with me this far. You've heard the quiet part. But it's what I did next that they never saw coming. The part that made them regret underestimating me. Keep listening. This story is only getting started. By the time I got home from the ceremony, my voicemail box was full. The first few messages were from Bradley, sounding unusually upbeat, the way he did when he wanted something but hadn't figured out how to ask yet. The next 3 were from Fiona, each one shorter than the last. She didn't apologize for missing the event. Not once. Just said she hoped everything went well and that we should talk soon. Her voice had that tight, artificial brightness she used at networking events, the kind that always made my skin crawl. I didn't return any of their calls that night. I took my time peeling off my suit jacket, hanging it neatly on the hook in my bedroom, then sitting quietly on the edge of the bed. The plaque and folded flag sat untouched in the hallway, just inside the door where Carmen had left them after helping me in. I didn't move them. I didn't want to look at them. Not yet. The next morning, I woke up before dawn, like I always do. Years of military discipline will do that to you, even long after you're retired. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat by the window. Rain tapped lightly against the glass, and the quiet hum of early Seattle traffic filled the air. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not sadness, not pride, not even disappointment. Just resolve. At 7 o'clock sharp, my phone rang again. This time I picked it up. Not to talk. I just listened. Bradley's voice was clear, too cheerful. He mentioned how amazing the ceremony looked online, how proud he was to see me honored like that. Then, almost casually, he said it was good to hear the city was investing in veteran support. Said it was great to see the community putting trust in someone with my experience. Then came the turn. He told me he had some ideas, some thoughts on how I could make the most of the resources I'd been given. Something about a community partnership proposal. I didn't catch all of it. I stopped listening around the time he said scalable impact. After he hung up, I deleted the message and opened my email. 10 new ones. 5 were from Bradley's company, each with some version of a project pitch attached. One had a budget file already drafted, with my name listed as the primary funder. Fiona didn't bother with subtlety. Her first text that day read, "Just read the article." "Wow, Mum, you should have told us about the land." Followed by, "Let's grab dinner this week. I have a friend who works in public grants. Thought you two should meet." They weren't wasting time, and neither was I. By noon, I called Carmen and asked if she could come over. She arrived in under an hour, holding a folder and a coffee cup. She didn't ask why I'd called. She knew. We sat at my kitchen table. I told her what I wanted to do. Not just talk about it. Put it in motion. Carmen listened, nodded, then opened her folder. Inside was a copy of the Veterans Property Grant Program paperwork, along with the contact card for Judge Harold Whitcomb. Retired. Private counsel. Trusted. And, more importantly, someone who had helped several veterans legally secure their benefits from opportunistic relatives. That same afternoon, we drove to Judge Whitcomb's office. No marble pillars or big city firm vibe, just a quiet one-story brick building tucked between a diner and a dental clinic. He met us in a sunlit room that smelled faintly of paper and old wood. I explained everything. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he leaned back and tapped his pen against the arm of his chair. Then he said 5 words I won't forget. "You waited long enough, Colonel." What we built over the next 4 hours wasn't a revenge plan. It was something smarter, cleaner. We drafted the legal foundation of what would become Lockwood Foundation. The funds, the land, and the title were to be placed under an irrevocable charter. The purpose was clearly stated. All assets would support the development of rehabilitation programs for underrepresented female veterans. No family member could access or control any portion of it. There were built-in protections, oversight clauses, public transparency requirements. Harold explained that even if my children sued, the trust would be bulletproof. Not only that, but once the charter was filed, I would no longer be able to touch the bulk of it either. That was what made it honest. Clean. A legacy, not a bargaining chip. I signed the first draft right there. Carmen witnessed, Harold notarized. When we left, it was still light out. A breeze rolled through the parking lot. I remember standing still for a moment beside the car, just breathing. The weight in my chest hadn't lifted. Not yet. But I could feel it shifting. Back at home, I opened the closet and pulled out the envelope Fiona had sent me last Christmas. It hadn't been opened. I remember thinking, at the time, it was probably just another glossy card with a smiling stock photo of her family. But now, I was curious. Inside was a gift certificate to a seafood place I couldn't eat at, and a handwritten note. "Hope this helps with groceries. Love you. Groceries." I sat at the table and stared at it for a long time. By evening, I had already drafted my public statement for the foundation launch. I included a short thank you to those who had supported me. I made no mention of family, no passive-aggressive lines, no shade, just facts. And the truth was simple. They had their chance. They chose their absence. Now I was choosing what came next, and I would choose it without them. 3 days after I filed the foundation paperwork with Judge Whitcomb, the shift in Bradley's tone was impossible to miss. He had called 4 times the previous day, left 2 voicemails, and followed up with a breezy email that included the subject line, "Exciting alignment opportunity." That morning, I opened another email from him, this one longer and more strategic. He had attached a PowerPoint deck titled Lockwood Legacy, Phase 1 Vision. Page after page, he outlined how my recent public honor could be used to generate momentum for community capital partnerships, featuring images of myself next to polished renderings of wellness centers and co-branded tech incubators. I scrolled through all 32 slides without blinking. At the bottom, a single line read, "All planning assumed mutual ownership of assets." That was the first time he had said it plainly. Ownership, not collaboration, not support, not tribute. Ownership. I closed the laptop and pushed it aside. The rain outside had picked up again, tapping at the kitchen window like a steady drum. My coffee had gone cold. That same afternoon, Fiona called. Her voice, as usual, was smooth. Her version of sincerity had always been thin, like plastic film stretched over something spoiled. She congratulated me again on the ceremony, told me she had finally watched the full stream. Then she mentioned that one of her PR clients, a women's leadership nonprofit, would love to partner with the foundation on media visibility. Said it would be a win-win. I knew what she meant. Their name would ride mine. Their hands would warm themselves over the flame I had built. I told her I appreciated her enthusiasm, but that I wasn't ready to involve outside parties. She fell silent for a beat, then said something about family not needing formalities. I hung up shortly after. That night, I couldn't sleep. I moved from the bed to the recliner in the living room, wrapped myself in the old navy throw I kept nearby, and sat there in the dark, listening to the ticking of the clock. A kind of pressure had begun to build in my chest. Not fear, something else. Like a rising awareness that the people who shared my blood were studying me as if I were a resource to be mined. It wasn't just the money, it was the visibility, the control. By the end of the week, the local news segment ran their follow-up on the Veteran Award recipients. I was featured for a full minute. There was a clip of me receiving the medal, a short soundbite about my years of service, and then a brief update on the foundation plans. I hadn't known they were doing that. Carmen called me as soon as it aired. An hour later, my doorbell rang. I didn't expect anyone. But I opened the door and there stood Bradley, rain on his jacket, his expression neutral. He stepped inside without waiting for me to say anything. Said he happened to be nearby and figured we could chat. I didn't offer him coffee. I didn't even ask him to sit. I stayed standing in the entryway, arms crossed. He launched into a calm, practiced pitch. Told me he was proud. Said he wanted to support me in any way possible. Then he mentioned that he had already spoken with a contact in city development who believed our foundation could benefit from their firm's consulting services. Our foundation. He used the phrase 3 times in less than 2 minutes. I asked him who gave him the impression that the foundation was a joint effort. He blinked, paused, then said he just assumed, since it was the Lockwood name, and we were family. That was the moment I knew what he was really after. Not a partnership, not redemption. It was leverage, visibility, a platform he hadn't built, but wanted to stand on. I told him calmly that the foundation's assets were legally bound by a community charter, that no family member, including me, could extract or reassign funds. His face twitched just slightly. He covered it with a smile, said he respected my decision. 15 minutes after he left, I got a text from Fiona. She said she was disappointed I hadn't included her in the founding documents, that she had hoped this would be a chance to reconnect and build something meaningful together. It was the same language she used the last time she convinced me to co-sign a lease for her failing boutique. I didn't respond. Instead, I called Harold the next morning and asked to update the foundation site with an official statement. I wrote it myself. It said that Lockwood Foundation was independently governed, with assets placed in a legally binding trust, and that it would not entertain private solicitations or family business affiliations. 2 days later, Fiona posted a long paragraph on her social media account, describing the pain of being cut out of her own mother's legacy. She framed it as a story about forgiveness and healing, but the timing was not subtle. She tagged news outlets, used all the right hashtags. The post got shared hundreds of times. Rachel Kim from Seattle Times reached out for comment. I had expected that. I agreed to a short phone interview. I told her the truth, that for years, my value in the eyes of my children had been measured only when it aligned with their interests, that I had chosen to invest my legacy into the people who had never treated me as a tool. She didn't twist a word of it in the article. That night, I sat with Carmen at the small kitchen table, the same place where we had started the paperwork days earlier. She passed me a glass of sweet tea and said nothing at first. Then she looked at me and said quietly, "You understand, they're not going to stop." I nodded, and I said, "Neither will I." And I meant it. I received the official invite to the Legacy Impact Summit in a cream-coloured envelope stamped with the city's seal. The event was set to feature the top 20 community initiatives funded in the last fiscal year, and the Lockwood Foundation had been selected as one of them. I didn't submit the application. Rachel Kim had quietly nominated us after our phone interview. The committee reached out after reviewing our charter and mission, calling it bold, specific, and timely. The ceremony was scheduled for a Friday afternoon at the downtown Civic Auditorium. I wore a simple dark blue suit and a pair of low-heeled shoes I hadn't used in years. Carmen offered to drive. I let her. Inside, the crowd was formal. Elected officials, local reporters, non-profit leaders, and donors mingled under white lights and floral centerpieces. There was a printed program, and I noticed the Lockwood Foundation was slotted in the final speaking segment. I assumed I'd be asked to say a few words. When the host took the stage, the room quieted. One by one, they introduced each initiative, pairing a short description with a brief video clip. Some organizations received polite applause. Others got cheers from guests who recognized familiar faces. Then came our turn. The screen flickered to life with a quiet piano track underneath black and white footage of female veterans working through physical therapy, walking across rehabilitation gyms, laughing in classroom sessions, holding mugs of coffee in shared kitchens. A narrator's voice read a single sentence from our charter. Dignity is not charity. Dignity is structure, support, and the space to begin again. Then the image cut to me. Standing at the podium from my medal ceremony, in full view, stating the foundation's purpose in front of the press. There was a pause, then applause. Louder than I expected, I was called to the stage. I approached the mic slowly, not out of hesitation, but to keep my pace measured, my expression steady. The lights were bright, but the room was quiet. Focused. I cleared my throat. I said I wasn't there to thank anyone. I said the foundation wasn't built because of support I received, but because of the lack of it. I said too many women served and returned to silence, to paperwork, to stretch paychecks and overdue appointments. I said what I had built was not a tribute to sacrifice, but a refusal to be erased. When I finished, there was a long beat of silence before the room erupted into applause. Some people stood. I turned my face slightly to the left, just enough to catch Carmen's expression. She was crying, but it was someone else I saw standing in the far back corner. Bradley. He wore a grey suit, arms folded, jaw tight. I didn't know how long he'd been there, but he was staring at me, and his presence was not subtle. He wanted me to know he was watching. As I walked off stage, an aide handed me a small folder with a certificate of recognition and a city pin. I thanked her and returned to my seat. After the event, the crowd filed into the reception area. Carmen stepped away to greet a colleague. I remained seated near the exit. Bradley approached minutes later. He didn't smile. His voice was low. He told me I had embarrassed him, that making our family look divided in front of public officials was unnecessary, that I had made him look like a stranger to his own mother. I looked at him. I didn't raise my voice. I said he had managed that on his own, that his absence did not need commentary, that the only reason anyone noticed was because he had made himself scarce when it mattered. He accused me of being vindictive, of enjoying the spotlight more than reconciliation. I replied that the spotlight was never my goal, that all I had wanted was to be seen fully, not selectively. He said he and Fiona had been talking with a legal advisor, that if the foundation operated with public funds and used the family name, there were grounds for shared governance. That was the moment I took out the press release in my purse. I handed it to him. It was set to publish the next morning across 3 local outlets. In it, I had stated clearly that the Lockwood Foundation had legally severed all personal financial ties to my immediate family. I had clarified that the name Lockwood did not denote affiliation, but founding origin only. I had added a quote from Judge Harold Whitcomb, affirming the legality and permanence of the trust's protective clauses. Bradley skimmed the paper. His hands stiffened as he read. I told him I had learned many things in my years of service, how to keep watch, how to endure silence, but most importantly, how to fortify a perimeter. He said I was going to regret this, that legacy was meant to be shared. I replied, "Not if you try to steal it." He left before the reception ended. The next morning, the article ran on schedule. Within hours, Fiona published a public statement on her agency's blog, claiming she was heartbroken and that I had chosen the narrative of division. She called it a betrayal, a rewriting of the family story. What she didn't expect was the response. Veterans, women, strangers. They flooded the comments section, not with hate, but with stories, testimonies of being forgotten, dismissed, of carving out space for dignity when no one else offered it. Rachel Kim forwarded me the analytics that evening. My speech had been clipped and shared more than 10,000 times in under 24 hours. That night, Carmen came over with a small bottle of wine. We sat on the back porch, watching the light fade across the water. She said nothing for a long time. Then finally she raised her glass slightly, to holding the line. I nodded, and to knowing when to let the rest burn. The day after the press release ran, I received a letter from a law firm in Bellevue. It was hand-delivered, not by courier, but by a man in a suit who waited at the edge of my property until I opened the door myself. He said my name clearly, handed me the envelope, and left without a word. Inside was a formal notification of intent. Bradley and Fiona were seeking emergency review of the foundation's structure under state charitable law. They claimed to be concerned about transparency, governance, and fiduciary oversight. In simpler terms, they were trying to challenge the irrevocability of the charter. They wanted the court to examine whether I had been influenced, misled, or impaired at the time of filing. It was a textbook move dressed up in concern. I didn't panic. I called Harold. He told me not to worry and asked me to meet him at his office the next morning. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, looking at the framed photo of my first deployment. Back then, I didn't know what loneliness meant. I had thought it was something that happened in silence. But it turned out loneliness could roar. It could come from being surrounded by people who knew your name, but not your value. I folded the letter and placed it inside my desk drawer. Then I went into the kitchen and brewed tea like I always did. No trembling, no anger, just steadiness. The kind that comes after enough people try to take something from you, and you finally decide not to let them. At Harold's office, we reviewed every document. He was calm, methodical. Every signature, every timestamp, every clause had been filed correctly. The foundation had been structured with multiple layers of legal insulation. He had anticipated this, even if I hadn't. "They cannot break it," he said, "but they can harass you." Over the next week, that's exactly what they tried to do. Bradley sent a follow-up letter accusing me of mental decline. Fiona released another statement implying that the Foundation's mission had been hijacked by people outside the family. Both efforts were laced with careful wording, soft enough to avoid slander, sharp enough to cast doubt. Rachel Kim contacted me privately. She said off the record that Fiona's statement had been pitched to a few national blogs. One had picked it up and spun it into a headline. "Estranged children of veteran colonel speak out about legacy confusion." It was nonsense, but it worked. For a day, the comments section was full of strangers speculating about mental fitness and manipulation. I stayed silent. The next morning, Lucas knocked on my door. He wore his school backpack and held a drawing in one hand. a crayon sketch of the foundation's main hall, with little flags on each side and stick figures in wheelchairs smiling in the windows. He said his teacher had asked them to draw a hero that week, and he picked me. I thanked him, kissed his forehead, and put the drawing on the fridge. Then I sat alone for a long time, staring at it. Of all the noise, this was the only voice that mattered. Harold called that afternoon. The hearing date had been set. It would be a preliminary review, not a trial. But Bradley and Fiona would have their chance to argue. So would we. On the morning of the hearing, Carmen drove me to the courthouse. She wore her navy pin. I wore mine. Neither of us spoke much during the ride. The air felt tight with memory. We arrived early. Harold met us at the front steps. His briefcase was already open, files neatly arranged, marked with coloured tabs. He looked confident. I felt ready. Inside, the room was quiet. The judge was a woman in her 60s with a firm voice and tired eyes. Bradley sat 2 rows ahead of us, adjusting his tie with stiff fingers. Fiona wore a beige dress and no expression at all. The proceedings were brief. Harold presented the documentation, walking through the charter, the intent, and the process. He spoke clearly, respectfully, without performance. Bradley's attorney tried to argue impairment, claimed undue influence by Carmen and the media, said my mental state had not been formally evaluated, said the foundation's name implied family endorsement, and that excluding the children was a breach of implied legacy. The judge asked a single question. Had either petitioner attempted to reach out to participate before the filing? They hadn't. That was all she needed to hear. She ruled in our favour. The charter remained intact. The request for review was denied. Any future claims would need substantial new evidence and would be subject to financial penalties for harassment. Fiona left first. She didn't look back. Bradley hesitated at the door. I stood, looked him in the eye, and nodded once. Not a goodbye, just acknowledgement. Outside, the wind had picked up. Carmen and I walked slowly down the steps, not speaking, just moving forward. That evening, I placed Lucas's drawing in a frame and set it on the table beside the foundation's registration certificate. I stood there for a long time, letting the quiet settle into the walls. They had come with paper and pressure, with language dressed like concern and smiles built to deceive. But they had forgotten one thing. You cannot take from someone who has already given it away. What I kept, what I still carried, was mine alone. My name, my mission, my peace. And they would never touch that again. A week after the hearing, things should have quieted down. Legally, there was nothing more to contest. The foundation was protected. The judge's ruling was clear. The trust structure could not be undone without exposing them to court sanctions and legal fees they couldn't afford to absorb. But some people cannot accept defeat when no audience is left to applaud them, and when ego meets silence, it doesn't fade. It festers. Bradley started small, subtle. He called one of the businesses leasing space in a building adjacent to the planned foundation property, claimed to be a consultant tied to the Lockwood name, dropped phrases like expansion potential and joint usage. It was easy to verify the truth, and even easier to shut it down, but the effort itself said enough. He was still circling. Fiona tried another tactic. She crafted a social media campaign around caregiving and aging parents, posted photos from her childhood, wrote captions about legacy and intergenerational misunderstanding. She even included a quote from a therapy blog about trauma responses in elder relationships. The subtext was clear, and the comments were flooded with sympathy. Not for me, for her. At first, I ignored it. I focused on the work. Construction permits had cleared, and early ground testing began on the edge of the 12-acre property. Carmen handled logistics with a quiet steadiness I depended on. We met every morning to review vendor updates and community interest inquiries. The momentum gave me something to stand on, something that didn't shift, depending on who approved or who showed up. But pressure doesn't always strike loud. Sometimes it shows up in envelopes. 2 came within 3 days. 1 was anonymous. A typed note, no return address, accusing me of alienating my family and laundering public money under the name of personal revenge. The second was from someone claiming to be a retired family mediator, urging me to consider reconciliation for the sake of public peace. It ended with a business card and a line about visibility and healing. I didn't respond to either, but I kept both in a drawer, not out of sentiment, but as record. Proof that letting go of people doesn't always mean they let go of you. The weight of all of it caught up with me one Sunday evening. Carmen had gone home after dinner. I stood at the sink, hands in warm water, rinsing off the dishes. My chest felt tight, but not from sorrow. It was something else. Like pressure had built over weeks and found no place to land. I sat down in the den and pulled out a notebook. Not a journal, just a lined pad I used for thoughts I didn't want to speak aloud. I wrote one sentence. They wanted the version of me they could silence. Then I set the pen down and let the quiet fill the room. The next day, Rachel called. She was working on a long-form story about veteran-led foundations and wanted to include Lockwood as a central feature. She asked for time on-site, interviews, and permission to document the early development stages. I agreed, not for publicity, but because stories only survive distortion when told in full. She came 2 days later with a photographer and a small team, walked the site, sat in on one of our planning sessions. At the end of the day, she pulled me aside. She said she had seen Fiona's posts, had received a few unsolicited messages suggesting she include family voices in her report. She didn't name names, but I already knew. I told her the truth. That estrangement is rarely one-sided, but it is often one-directional. That people like Fiona want forgiveness before they even offer apology. That their storylines always end with the same request: return what they feel entitled to, and call it healing. Rachel listened without taking notes, just nodded once and said she understood. The article ran the following week. It was balanced, honest. No heroics, no demonizing, just the facts. The timeline, the mission, the hurdles, the clarity. And at the center, the foundation's future, not its wounds. The response was immediate. Donors reached out, local volunteers offered support. A neighboring university offered to partner with us on a veteran mentorship program. A nurse from the VA clinic emailed asking to join the Wellness Center development team. And for the first time since this all began, I slept 8 hours without waking once. But Fiona didn't take the silence well. She posted another message. Longer this time, less polished, more personal. She used words like betrayal. She said the foundation had turned into a monument of bitterness. She questioned my character, my decisions, my integrity. She said Lucas had been weaponized, that I had used him for public sympathy. That last line pierced sharper than the rest, not because it was true, but because it attempted to dirty something pure. I didn't respond online, but I printed the post, filed it, and then made a quiet decision. That Friday, I met with Harold again. We drafted an addendum to the foundation charter. It outlined a secondary trust, a small education fund named after my late sister, someone Fiona never bothered to know. The fund would be overseen by an independent board and activated only when Lucas turned 18, contingent on no contact or influence from either Bradley or Fiona. It wasn't revenge. It was protection. And it was the first time in years I wrote someone into my legacy without fear. The sky outside darkened as we finalized the draft. Harold slid the papers across the table. I signed with a steady hand. There was nothing theatrical about it, just quiet certainty, because some things don't need to be shouted. They just need to be secured. A few days after the article was published and the addendum filed, things settled into a rhythm again. The construction crew cleared the last of the debris from the lot's western edge. Carmen finalized the first round of local hiring. The city planning board sent over its final sign-off. And for a brief moment, the project moved forward without noise from the outside. But noise always finds a way in. It started with a voicemail left on the foundation's general line. The voice was clipped, professional. A man from the Department of Regulatory Compliance said there had been a citizen inquiry filed against the Lockwood Foundation regarding alleged misuse of community land grants. He said a site inspection would be scheduled in the coming week and requested access to all zoning and construction permits. I called Harold. He told me calmly to scan and send him everything, which I did. There was nothing out of place. Every document had been filed, verified, and made public according to protocol. Still, the timing spoke louder than the words. A few days later, Rachel Kim forwarded me an anonymous tip submitted to her editorial team. It accused me of building a private estate under the guise of a non-profit. It said I had orchestrated a media campaign to manipulate public sentiment. The language was formal but bitter, like someone trying to sound official while dragging something personal behind each line. I didn't need proof. I knew where it came from. I also knew why it had intensified. Lucas's school had published a piece in their monthly bulletin. A simple paragraph about how one of their students had a grandparent who was building a wellness center for veterans. They had printed a photo of Lucas's drawing, the one with the little flags and stick figures in wheelchairs. It wasn't meant to make a statement, but it had. Fiona's reaction was fast and direct. That same afternoon, she posted again, this time not from her PR account, but from her personal one. It was a long caption beneath a throwback family photo. She wrote about feeling erased, about how narratives can be edited to exclude. She said motherhood was not always loud, and that just because someone doesn't show up in a headline doesn't mean they didn't shape the story. It was poetic, manipulative, and designed to wound without striking directly. People sympathized, comments poured in, but that was not what stung. What stung was what came next. Carmen showed up at my door 2 days later, holding her phone tight in her palm. She had just left a logistics meeting at the city offices. While there, she overheard a clerk on the phone mentioning a new proposal being pushed to the council by a small group of residents. The proposal aimed to block zoning for additional expansion on our site. According to Carmen, the name Lockwood came up, more than once. That night, I stayed up reading over every zoning map, every structural amendment, every clause tucked into the site charter. Then I picked up the phone and called the only person I hadn't spoken to since the hearing. Bradley. He answered quickly, his voice flat. I told him I wasn't calling to debate, that I knew he and Fiona had leveraged everything they could, publicly and privately, to undermine the project. That this no longer had anything to do with legacy or family. It was interference, and it was no longer being tolerated. He didn't deny it. He only said one thing. You never gave us a way back in. That sentence didn't move me. It didn't sting. It settled. Because it was the clearest admission I'd heard. I didn't answer. I simply hung up, then called Harold and asked him to prepare a cease and desist. The next morning, the notice was sent. It stated in precise terms that any further interference with the Foundation's operations, legal, regulatory, or reputational, would trigger a full-scale harassment claim. It named both Bradley and Fiona. It referenced prior incidents, past legal attempts, and existing protective orders. It was not aggressive, it was final. And this time, it worked. The anonymous complaints stopped. The calls quieted. The posts dried up. There were no more quotes, no more blurry pictures, no more vague references to forgiveness and fractured ties. Instead, there was quiet. And in that quiet, the Foundation moved forward. The ground was levelled, steel was delivered. The City Council voted unanimously in favour of continued zoning support. One of the council members even came to the site and shook my hand. Carmen documented the progress, Rachel drafted a follow-up piece, and Lucas started drawing updated sketches of the main hall's layout. That Saturday, I sat outside on the rear porch of my house. Sunlight fell across the railing. The air smelled like grass and fresh paint from a neighbour's fence. I held the blueprint of the wellness centre in one hand and Lucas's newest drawing in the other. He had drawn a room full of veterans in wheelchairs and prosthetics, but this time they were teaching. One was drawing on a whiteboard. Another was helping a younger person adjust a device on their arm. In the corner of the page, in small block letters, Lucas had written, "Healing is a cycle. You give it, you get it." I closed my eyes for a moment, not out of pain, not out of weariness, but because the wind was soft and I wanted to remember that exact sound. The sound of building, of forward, of something earned, staying earned, and most of all the sound of no one trying to take it away. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the kind of silence that comes with peace, but the kind that comes before a storm. Carmen wasn't at the site that morning. Rachel had messaged late the night before to let me know she was covering a different story. Harold hadn't responded to my last email, though I figured it was due to travel. It wasn't unusual. And yet I felt it. That old tightening in the chest. A tension I couldn't explain. Until the mail came. The envelope was thick, white, government stamped. Inside, a notice of audit. Not from the city, but from the state. It claimed a discrepancy in the non-profit's structure. Said certain financial allocations were being re-examined under new grant oversight procedures. It wasn't an accusation, not yet. But it was a door cracking open. I read the letter twice. Then I went upstairs, opened the locked filing cabinet, and pulled out the binder that held the Foundation's charter, its tax-exempt status, every relevant license, agreement, and banking record. All in order. I wasn't worried. Not in the way that fear gnaws at you. I was just tired. That evening, I met with Carmen and laid everything out on the work table. She read through the audit request quietly, her face still, her breath slow. "This is targeted," she said without looking at me. "They're not done." I didn't need her to say who they were. We both knew. The next day, I filed a formal response, attaching all necessary documentation. I copied Harold and looped in 2 compliance attorneys I had worked with years ago. I did not panic, but that night, I took the long way home. I stopped by the edge of the lot and looked at the steel skeleton of the wellness centre, the way it cut through the sky. A shape not yet finished, but undeniable. That's when I understood. This wasn't about land, or legacy, or even money. It was about control, about who got to define truth when the old one no longer served. That week, Bradley and Fiona reappeared in the headlines. A puff piece in a mid-tier magazine featuring successful family entrepreneurs overcoming personal loss. The timing wasn't coincidence. In the interview, they didn't mention me by name, but the subtext was sharp. Bradley spoke about navigating betrayal from within, and Fiona smiled through her lines about letting go of stories that no longer uplift. I didn't react publicly, but I took note. On Thursday, Carmen forwarded an internal email from City Zoning. A minor clause in our construction plan had been flagged as in need of clarification. Nothing serious, but it would require a temporary hold on new supply deliveries. I called the zoning office directly and was transferred 3 times before someone admitted, off the record, that the complaint had come from a former affiliated party. No name was given, no need. I could feel the walls tightening again. But this time, something in me refused to retreat. So I called Rachel. I told her everything, not just the audit or the zoning interference, but the full weight of it, the smear campaigns, the manipulation, the smiling social media posts hiding a scalpel underneath. She listened, then said only one thing. "It's time you said something too." The next day, she brought a photographer and sat with me on the foundation site. I didn't speak in anger. I spoke in facts. In the long months of paperwork, late nights, silent losses, and the slow reclamation of a voice that had been buried under decades of politeness. We walked through the unfinished buildings. I showed her the room designed for trauma therapy, the garden area for community meals, the low-step walkways, all designed with wheelchairs and prosthetics in mind. Then I showed her the shelf. It was just a wooden beam mounted in the east hallway. On it, a small plaque with my husband's name, and beneath it, a line etched into brass. "Leave no one behind, especially not yourself." That afternoon, she filed the story. It went live within 24 hours. The headline wasn't dramatic, it was clear. Veteran's widow builds sanctuary amid legal battles with her own children. The photos were stark. One of me holding Lucas's drawing, another of the half-finished center, sunlight cutting across its frame. The impact was immediate. I received over 200 emails in the first 48 hours. Messages from women, from nurses, from veterans' spouses, from people who had never seen themselves in stories like this. Donations surged, volunteers doubled. Even the city council issued a statement, reaffirming its commitment to our zoning plan. Bradley stayed silent. But Fiona posted again. A clipped, cold paragraph about privacy and boundaries and the right to move on without public explanation. It didn't land the way her earlier posts had. This time, people questioned. They read between the lines. Some of her own followers commented with quotes from Rachel's article. It was subtle, but it was enough. Then on Monday, the audit was dropped. Just like that. A line in a follow-up email. Upon review, no further action will be taken. All documents have been verified and found compliant. Carmen printed it and pinned it to the corkboard in the site office. I didn't celebrate. I just exhaled. Because I knew what came next. The permits would resume. The construction would move forward. But so would the resentment. Bradley wasn't finished. Fiona would find another way. But it didn't matter, because this time I had spoken. I had named it. And once something is named, it can no longer hide behind half-truths. It must face the light. The call came just after 6 in the morning. Carmen's voice was steady but clipped. The site had been vandalized overnight. Spray paint on the foundation walls, broken glass near the supply shed, a smashed window in the south wing. I didn't ask for details. I told her I'd be there in 20 minutes. When I arrived, the sky was still a deep navy, and the air carried that early stillness before the day breathes in. Carmen stood with 2 officers, arms folded across her chest. One of the steel beams had been graffitied with a red phrase written in thick block letters. Leave your pity elsewhere. It didn't rattle me, not the way they might have hoped. But it did slow my step, just for a second. Rachel arrived 10 minutes later. She photographed the scene quietly. No flash, no questions. Just that look on her face that said she understood this wasn't just petty vandalism. It was a message, a warning. Carmen handed me a clipboard, a short list of missing items, some copper piping, a power drill, a few locked bins forced open and rummaged through. But the bigger blow was symbolic. The paint, the broken glass, the attempt to intimidate. I sat on the edge of the low garden wall and looked at it all, not as a victim, but as someone whose patience had been stretched to its edge. That afternoon, I made 3 calls. The first was to our security provider. I upgraded the entire system: cameras, floodlights, on-site response. The second was to the city. I requested a formal incident report be filed and tied directly to our zoning and construction files. The third was to Harold. He answered on the second ring. His voice carried the weight of someone who knew he'd been silent too long. I didn't scold him. I didn't ask why he hadn't responded sooner. I simply told him what had happened, what it meant, and what I intended to do. The next morning, I called a press conference. Not a flashy one, no podium, no banners, just a microphone, a few chairs, and the steel bones of the center behind me. Rachel stood to the side. Carmen kept watch near the entrance. Volunteers lined the back wall. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. I began with the facts, the threats, the vandalism, the pattern. Then I named names. I spoke clearly, not out of revenge, but out of necessity. I stated, without embellishment, that Bradley and Fiona had deliberately interfered with the non-profit's operations, that their legal complaints were unfounded, that their attempts to discredit me had failed, and that from this moment forward, I would be pursuing legal action. I ended with a single sentence: this place will rise, even if I have to pour every brick myself. When I stepped away from the microphone, the crowd was silent for a beat. Then applause broke out, quiet at first, then louder. I didn't smile, I didn't bow. I just stood still, letting the truth settle into the air. 2 hours later, Rachel's clip of the speech went viral. Not in the way celebrity gossip does, but in that steady, rolling way when something hits a nerve that's already been rubbed raw for years. Older women shared it: nurses, teachers, widows, people with no platforms, no followers, just truth. That night, national outlets picked it up. By morning, I had interview requests, speaking invitations, inquiries from legal aid groups wanting to help. But it was the envelope on my porch that shifted everything. No return address. Inside, a letter, typed, anonymous. It said Fiona had used foundation funds, mine, originally, to pay off a private contractor for renovations on their lake house. That the payment had been disguised as consulting fees through a shell LLC. The letter included an invoice copy and an address. I took it to Harold. He brought in a forensic accountant. Within a week, we had a paper trail. A clean one, a damning one. I didn't confront them. I went straight to the Attorney General's office. Formal charges were filed. Misappropriation of charitable funds, fraudulent reporting, possible tax evasion. It was slow at first. But the system moved. They were served. Their accounts were frozen. An official review of the non-profit structure under their management began. That's when Bradley showed up, not in public, not with an apology, but at the center, late one afternoon. He stood outside the chain-link fence and waited. I saw him from the second floor. Carmen looked at me. I nodded. He came in alone. No press, no lawyer. We sat in the bare lobby. The air smelled of fresh concrete and sawdust. He looked older, not just tired, eroded. He started to speak. Something rehearsed, maybe. But I stopped him. I told him I didn't need his version of an explanation. Not anymore. Then I handed him a folder. Inside was the audit summary, the letter from the AG's office, the invoice from the shell contractor, and a printed photo of the first therapy room, nearly finished. "You took from something meant to heal others," I said. He didn't deny it. He just sat there. Then I said the thing I knew would break him. "You were my son, but you don't get to be my legacy." He left without another word. That night, I sat by the garden wall again. Carmen joined me. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. The moon was low, casting silver over the cement and scaffolding. And in that quiet, I felt something shift. Not victory, but clarity. The kind that comes after a long storm, when the wind finally dies and you realize you're still standing, not untouched, but whole in a way you hadn't known you could be. I looked at the center, still unfinished, but rising, always rising. 2 weeks passed. The dust from the public fallout had started to settle, but the ground underneath was still shifting. I could feel it in every phone call, every glance across the room. Not fear, not even regret. Just the quiet discomfort of people realizing that silence had a cost. I didn't spend my time waiting for apologies. I spent it on the job site. I met with volunteers. I finalized supplier contracts. I walked the perimeter of the property every morning with a notebook in hand, jotting down details that needed fixing. A misaligned door frame, a crack in a support column, a patch of paint that didn't settle right. Small things, but they mattered. This place wasn't going to rise halfway. Harold sent word that charges against Fiona had moved from civil to criminal. The wire transfers, the shell corporation, and the double entries in her accounting software had painted a clear enough picture. They called it premeditated misappropriation. I called it betrayal dressed in tax forms. Bradley hadn't been formally charged, but he'd been named in depositions. The distance between him and the mess he helped create was shrinking. Rachel stopped by the center on a rainy Thursday. She brought tea and one of those folders she always carried when she had something hard to say. I didn't sit. I kept sweeping dust from the floor of what would be the reading room. She stood near the door. Her eyes were softer than usual. "There's been backlash," she said. "Sponsors pulling out. One of the city council members is asking whether your foundation still qualifies for tax-exempt status, given the scandal." I nodded. I'd expected it. "I'll take the meetings," I said. "I'll speak for myself." "And you'll be alone in those rooms," she said, not unkindly. I kept sweeping. I've stood alone in harder rooms. That night, I drafted a letter to the city council. No emotion, just facts. The work we were doing, the financial transparency we'd enforced, the oversight committees we'd brought in. I printed it, signed it, and mailed it the next morning. The following Monday, I walked into City Hall with Carmen beside me. We wore grey, no branding, no matching scarves. We didn't come to plead. We came to state. The hearing room was cold. The chairs were hard plastic, the kind meant to discourage lingering. 5 members sat at the front. 3 looked tired. 1 looked skeptical. The last one I recognized from a gala years ago, back when Bradley still called me Mum in public. I read the statement aloud. Then I waited. The questions came. Some reasonable, some barbed. Why had I not vetted Fiona more carefully? Why had the transfer of assets occurred so suddenly? Why hadn't I reported the vandalism earlier? I answered calmly. because I trusted my son, because the paperwork was legal, because I didn't want to weaponize sympathy. The room went quiet after that. Later, I would learn that the board voted 4-1 to uphold the centre's non-profit status. The final holdout wrote a dissenting opinion. I framed it and hung it in the administrative hallway. Let them remember that not everyone will believe in you, even when truth sits plain on the table. Meanwhile, construction moved faster than we'd hoped. A group of retired contractors had volunteered to assist. They said they were tired of sitting on porches while their hands remembered work. I baked bread for them every Friday. We laughed more. Carmen painted a mural in the east hallway, a tree with women's names carved into the trunk. Some of the names were fictional, some weren't, but every one of them had a root. In the background, Bradley tried to file an appeal on the will. He claimed I had coerced my husband's final decision. The court threw it out. Lack of standing, lack of evidence, too much arrogance. Then came the letter from my former daughter-in-law. It was written in longhand, neat cursive. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She simply said she was moving to Oregon and wouldn't be contesting anything further. She included a small photograph of my grandson. He was holding a toy hammer, standing in front of a wooden bench he'd clearly helped build. "He has your eyes," she wrote, "and he's starting to ask why you're not around." I read the letter twice. Then I folded it and placed it inside the kitchen drawer, behind the recipe for lemon pound cake. I hadn't baked in years. I didn't write back. Not yet. Some wounds need to seal on their own. Carmen called a few days later to say the city inspector had given final clearance on the main structure. We could begin interior fittings the following week. That evening, I walked through the building alone. The rooms were still empty, but the walls were breathing. I ran my hand along the banister. The smooth wood, the scent of primer and quiet determination. I paused at the main hall where the community dinners would take place. It wasn't just drywall and beams anymore. It was proof. Proof that I could lose everything people thought defined me and still rebuild something stronger. I stood in that space for a long time. Not mourning, not dreaming, just being. And for the first time in a long while, I felt the past start to loosen its grip. It didn't vanish. It just stepped aside, made room for something else. Hope, maybe. Or peace, if not that. The kind that doesn't demand attention, but simply exists, waiting to be filled. The first snow fell the morning we opened the doors. It wasn't planned. The ceremony had been scheduled for the following week, with ribbons and local press and smiling politicians looking for another good photo. But the storm moved early, and the forecast called for black ice by nightfall. So Carmen made the call. We'd open quietly. No speeches, no press kits, just doors unlocked and lights turned on. I arrived before sunrise. The center was warm, silent except for the soft hum of the heating system kicking in. I made a pot of coffee in the communal kitchen, poured a cup, sat at the round table by the window, watched as the frost glazed the pavement outside. By 8, the first woman arrived. She was older than I expected, probably in her late 60s. Her jacket was torn at the sleeve, and she held a small duffel bag close to her chest, like it carried everything she had left. Carmen greeted her gently, offered a seat and a blanket. No forms, no questions, just welcome. By noon, 6 more had trickled in. One of them asked if she could help sweep. Another wandered the art therapy room and stood silently in front of a blank canvas. I didn't introduce myself as the founder. I didn't need to. They weren't here for names. They were here because the world outside hadn't made space for them. And this place did. That evening, after everyone had gone to their rooms, I walked the halls in silence. Each door bore a single word, hand-painted in soft brushstrokes. Rest, breathe, begin, stay. I paused at one that read, Remember. My reflection stared back at me from the narrow glass pane, framed in soft yellow light. I didn't look triumphant. I looked tired, but whole. Later that week, Rachel called. She'd spoken to a regional non-profit that wanted to fund a second centre. They were impressed with the model, impressed that it ran without drama, without spectacle. She asked if I'd consider licensing the name. I told her I'd think about it. That same day, a courier dropped off a sealed envelope. There was no return address, just my name written in a handwriting I hadn't seen in years. Inside was a short letter from Bradley. No apology, no admission of guilt, just 2 lines. They tell me you still walk every morning. I never deserved your silence. I folded the note in half. Didn't tear it. Didn't call. I set it aside, tucked between the pages of a gardening book I hadn't opened in months. Some truths didn't need confrontation. They just needed space to echo and fade. 3 days later, a young woman named Leah asked to speak with me. She'd been staying at the centre since the first snowfall. Quiet, soft-spoken, always the last to enter the dining hall, always the first to clean up after. She sat across from me in the main lounge. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled a folded piece of paper from her sweater. A resume. She'd studied social work before her life unraveled. She wanted to help, not just because she needed a job, because she understood what it meant to be unseen. I hired her that afternoon. That evening, Carmen and I stood outside as another snowfall drifted through the streetlights. She asked me how I felt now that it was all real, now that the walls stood and the rooms were full. I told her I didn't feel like I'd won, because it wasn't a victory. It was something older than that, something quieter, like putting your hand on the earth after it's been scorched and realizing something still breathes beneath. I didn't cry, not then. But that night, alone in my apartment, I found myself standing at the window, watching snow gather on the sill. I thought of all the rooms I'd been shut out of, all the moments I'd been dismissed, erased, betrayed. And yet here I was. Not because of revenge, not because of strategy, because I'd refused to vanish, because I'd chosen to create something no one could steal or smear, not even him. 2 weeks later, the first press article came out. They called me a survivor, a philanthropist, a pioneer for elder women reclaiming space. But none of that mattered as much as what happened a week after the article ran. A letter came from Oregon. This time, it was from Fiona. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't beg for understanding. She just said one thing. He's teaching our son to build birdhouses. I told him you once built a house no one could tear down. I read that line over and over. Then I set the letter down, walked out to the community garden, and began digging the first bed for spring vegetables. Not because I needed the food, but because it was mine to plant, mine to grow. And this time, no one would stop me. Spring came slowly that year. The frost lingered longer than usual, clinging to the windows of the community centre and leaving soft, white fingers across the raised garden beds. But inside, the place pulsed with quiet life. Women gathered each morning in the kitchen to knead dough and share stories. They took turns tending the compost bin, watering the soil, planting herbs whose names I had long forgotten and now relearned. And I kept walking. Each day, at dawn, I laced my shoes and made my way around the block, a ritual older than the centre itself. My bones ached less. My breath steadied sooner. The sidewalks remembered me. Or maybe I remembered myself. One morning, as I came in from my walk, I saw Leah sitting on the porch with a young woman I didn't recognize. Her eyes were cautious, but her hands were steady. Leah stood and introduced her. She said she was looking for a place to volunteer. I offered her coffee. She said she'd already had 3 cups. I smiled and said that was a good sign. Later that day, I found a small stack of mail in my office. Most of it was the usual: grant updates, invoices, 2 thank you cards from former residents, and 1 letter, addressed by hand, with no return address again. Inside was a printed notice. Bradley had entered into a plea agreement: financial misconduct, fraud, elder abuse. It was a brief, clinical document. Not a single word about me. No mention of the centre. Just a note at the bottom saying the ruling was sealed, per his request. I folded the paper, placed it inside my desk, locked the drawer. I didn't feel vindicated, just free. For the first time in a long while, my story wasn't orbiting his shadow. It stood on its own, breathed on its own, walked forward without asking permission. That weekend, the board of directors met for the quarterly update. Carmen presented numbers. Rachel brought projections for a second location. Leah offered a plan to expand evening workshops. They didn't ask for my approval. They informed me. That was the point. I was no longer needed as the centre, but I was still welcome inside it. The next morning, I visited the old neighbourhood. The house was long sold. A young couple now lived there, with a small dog and bright yellow curtains in the window. I didn't stop, just passed by, nodded once to the porch railing, and kept walking. The graveyard was quiet. I brought fresh flowers, not out of obligation, but habit. Sat by the headstone. Let the breeze wrap around my shoulders. I told him about the garden, about the women, about how the coffee still burned if left too long in the pot. I told him that Fiona hadn't written again, but that was all right. Some silences no longer cut. They simply became space. I stayed longer than I planned. The sun had shifted by the time I stood up. My knees cracked. I laughed. On the walk back, I passed a bookstore. In the window was a display of memoirs, all bold titles, triumphs and tragedies in capital letters. I paused, watched my reflection in the glass. There was no title big enough to hold the quiet work of remembering yourself, no chapter heading for the daily act of choosing not to disappear. And that was fine. The story wasn't over. It just didn't need to be loud anymore. That evening, the centre hosted a dinner. Not a fundraiser, not a campaign, just a meal. Soup, bread, soft music on a scratched speaker. I sat beside Leah. She asked if I still had a favourite room in the building. I told her no. They all belonged to someone else now. I had a garden. I had my walks. I had my name back. And that was enough. If you've ever felt like your story was being written by someone else, maybe today is the day to start rewriting it. Quietly, boldly, or somewhere in between. I didn't do anything grand. I just stopped disappearing. And maybe that's where healing begins. If this story stayed with you in some way, I'd love to know. Not for me, but for the version of you who needs to feel seen. Tell me what part echoed for you, or just leave a word that feels like home.